Welcome from Washington, D.C. My name is Brad Pomerance, and we are joined by Lois Capps. She is a member of the United States Congress representing the beautiful Central Coast of California. It's so good to see you again, of course.
My pleasure, Brad. Thank you for bringing Charter to Washington, D.C.
It's our pleasure. I want to speak with you about water and the drought. And in so many ways, the Central Coast is a microcosm of California. The city of San Luis Obispo, plenty of water, no problem. Paso Robles, in real trouble.
Yes.
Talk to us on the ground.
We are definitely in a drought.
Right.
And there's not a lot we can do to decide whether it's going to rain or not. But what we can do is make available resources for businesses and farmers, folks who are affected by the drought. And I want to make sure that I'm glad you're scrolling our
Yes.
information about how to contact our offices on the screen, so that if you have a business that has been unduly affected by the drought, give our office a call and we can put you in touch with the Small Business Administration and or the U.S. Department of Agriculture, both of which have some low interest loans available. Now, they're, you have to apply for them and so forth, but we're happy to work with some of our folks to make sure that whatever assistance is there, we can bring to our constituents in this tough, tough time.
And I think about your constituents. I think about the wineries in Paso. I think about the strawberry farms in Santa Barbara County. I mean, so important, not only for California, but for the nation.
Absolutely.
Talk to us about your constituents. How are they doing? Are they surviving? What's happening?
Well, agriculture is the core of our economy on the Central Coast. You mentioned some of our crops, but we still have cattle, we have a fishing industry. Of course, they don't depend upon the rain, but we are labor intensive in terms of some of the salad bowl, if you will,
literally,
that grows in the Santa Maria Valley up in really throughout the whole Central Coast. And these folks depend upon water, and we want to make sure that whatever resources we can bring during this tough time, that we do that, and that we give full advantage to some of our local folks.
So there's a lot of question about how to rectify this drought, what we can do today, what we can do in the future. What can we do today? We'll talk about storage soon, but what can we do today?
Well, what we can do today is make sure that whatever resources the federal government, in addition to those that the state and local governments can provide, and the public in general, can receive the benefits that are available.
Right.
That's what we can do today.
But what about the steps that you and I can take, the consumer or the farmer, whomever it may be?
We certainly do want to be mindful of conservation, and that goes without saying, making sure that we use water carefully now during these times, that we don't waste it, that there are systems in place in many of our local communities to capture runoff, to reuse water, gray water, so to speak, for some of the purposes, and those are decided by our individual communities.
And that's the question. I mean, should we be taking mandatory steps? Governor Brown has said not yet, but some are.
Some are, and it's up to the local communities to decide whether they should or should not. But we all are mindful that whatever we can do to turn off the tap when we're brushing our teeth, I mean, those simple little things multiplied really make a difference.
Shower length, thinking about your usage when you go to the bathroom,
yes,
whether one should flush the toilet or not. Forgive me for saying that, but those are things to consider.
And we've been through drought before. There are localities that have gone into the business of desalination. And those are local decisions as well.
And I'd love to talk to you about that when we come back. For our viewers on HLN, we thank you so much for joining us. For our other viewers, we'll be right back with Congresswoman Lois Capps. So, Congresswoman, you mentioned desalination, and that is seen as a potential remedy for the drought. You may know there's some desal plants opening in Southern California, Carlsbad, for example. But what we do know about desal, it's expensive.
Yes, it is.
So is that an approach we should continue to pursue, hoping that economies of scale will bring it down, or are there other approaches?
Well, this again is for the local community to decide if they want to invest in the money. I live in Santa Barbara, so we made that decision to build a plant several years ago. Then it began to rain.
Right.
And the drought ended, and so it never was really implemented.
I
But
see.
I know there's an interest in redoing that.
Let's talk about storage.
Yes.
Because that is a question that is on the minds of both electeds in Sacramento as well as DC. In Sacramento, there's discussion of a water bond. I know you're not in Sacramento, but that's a big issue, as well as in DC. I know your friends on the Republican side passed some legislation that was looking towards changing some of the environmental regulations, focusing on storage. Where do we go on the question of storage as a future solution?
Ooh, I think what we need to do is look at every angle and examine the value. I don't believe we need to lower our environmental standards. I think we've established those, and I believe we can do this. We can meet this challenge using the environmental standards that are in place, and still look at avenues for storing water and for making sure that the next drought, there will be one, that we're better prepared for.
Do we need to look toward increasing storage capacity in your mind?
I think that certainly is on the table and needs to be studied.
I want to talk about a new caucus you started. It's
Yes.
very exciting. It's called the Cut Flower Caucus. Tell us about it.
Well, you know, cut flowers are a big business
Huge.
on the Central Coast. Particular parts of my district, there are many cut flower gardeners, the growers, and it is a big part of our economy. So Duncan Hunter represents a district in the San Diego area.
Sure. A Republican member.
And he is a Republican member. This is definitely a bipartisan caucus. And come to find out, there are cut flowers grown in every state in the country.
All 50.
All 50. So we think this has the opportunity to become a big chunk of our interest in supporting this industry. You know, their biggest challenge, these growers, are the fact that we have environmental standards, we have labor standards, and some of the competing countries, mostly South America, are really eating into the business. And so we want to really support our domestic cut flower business. And I want to report that the last state dinner in the White House, they were featuring domestic flowers.
I love it.
So we're making a big deal out of that.
You speak about our friends south of the border, and that begs the question about immigration reform. I recently had really the honor and privilege to interview some of your presumed constituents, Oaxacan agriculture workers, and they touched me in a lot of ways. Oaxaca's a region in Mexico.
Yes.
And they pick strawberries.
And they are constituents.
Right,
Many of
yes,
them are
yes,
on the Central Coast.
yeah.
They pick the strawberries, they
Right.
pick the citrus, and they pick the avocados.
Right. So where do we stand on immigration reform? It seemed as if there may have been some momentum in the House earlier this year, but maybe not now.
You know, I did a series of listening sessions among my constituents a few months ago with the agriculture community, high-tech community, faith community, universities where there are so many people that want to continue their education. It is really time to pass comprehensive immigration reform in the House. The Senate passed a bill, and it's not a perfect bill, but it makes sure that our borders stay secure. It makes sure that families are unified. It provides a pathway to citizenship for the hundreds of thousands of people living in the shadow.
So I know that your friends in the Republican caucus in California are likely to support what you've just said. But the challenge becomes your friends that are not from California in the Republican caucus. And
Well,
so
it's primarily, I didn't mean
Yeah,
to interrupt
no.
you, Brad. It's primarily the leadership. Frankly, if the bill that the Senate passed were brought to the floor of the House tomorrow, we would vote for it and it would get signed into law. And it's dragging our economy back not to pass comprehensive immigration reform. I've heard this time and time again from our high-tech industries, for example, in my district, who say they can't get the workforce that they need. These are highly skilled workers. They come from other countries, some of them, not all, but a fair number, and we don't want to block that avenue.
Her name is Lois Capps. She is a member of the United States Congress representing the beautiful Central Coast of California. My name is Brad Pomerance. Thank you so much for joining us from Washington, D.C.
Thank you.
Welcome to Washington, D.C. Yes, we are coming to you from the Longworth office building. We are joined by Jim Costa. I'm Brad Pomerance, of course, and Mr. Costa is a member of the United States Congress representing significant portions of the Central Valley. And sir, I must ask you about your constituents. We are facing a drought like we have never seen before.
Drought.
Yeah. How are your constituents doing, sir?
Well, it's difficult. This is the third consecutive dry year, and the cumulative effects, I think, are frightful. We have a situation where before these last storms, we had 13% of our average snowpack, 13%. And our carryover water on our reservoirs normally at this time of year is 40 to 60%, and it's 20 to 30% right now in terms of water that's behind the reservoir. So the cumulative effect is bad. And while the rains have been helpful here in the last week, the fact is that we would need water of biblical proportions, 40 days, 40 nights, really to get us to a position where we could try to make a real difference. I mean, most people don't understand in California, we get most of our moisture between November and March, and this is March.
The big question becomes, what do we do for the future? We can talk about the current state now, but the big buzzword we've been hearing is storage. We need more storage. Your friends on the Republican side have been talking about storage for some time. In fact, they proposed a bill that was passed with Republican votes, as well as one California Democrat, yourself.
Right.
Talk to us about Mr. Valledeo's bill and why you decided to move forward.
Well, I voted for that bill. I voted for a version of it several years ago, and there are a lot of good aspects as it allows us to create flexibility in both the federal and state water projects to move water. And the storage component in the measure is something that I've supported in the past. But in that bill, there was no federal funding for those storage projects, which I question because, frankly, most of the major projects in California have had a share of local, state, and federal funding. Now, if there's not going to be any federal funding, I don't see how we're going to get some of these storage projects built. Last week, I introduced legislation on 5 related storage projects. They're the same, but we provide a federal cost-sharing component in that for Shasta,
right,
for Sites Reservoir that will be introduced this week that I'm a co-sponsor on. Los Vasqueros is going to be up to the Contra Costa folks. Enlargement of San Luis Reservoir, which is in my district, it's a state and federal shared project. We could add 400,000 acre-feet of water to that. And Temperance Flat, which is near my district, that would produce the flexibility of moving water north and south without the problems associated with the Delta.
So exciting possibilities in terms of storage.
I think this is the time that we have an opportunity to come together on a bipartisan basis on storage. We need it. And in the governor's long-term proposal, the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, storage is envisioned, and they're looking at a water bond this November.
Let's talk about the water bond, because there is money set aside in the water bond, whatever version may wind up moving forward. The Democrats looking towards $1.5 billion, the Republicans looking for about $3 billion. Is either figure enough?
No, I think, frankly, from the previous bond that they're going to have to amend in some fashion if they reach an agreement, and I think they will. We're talking about something less than the $11 billion, but probably around $8 billion, I would hope, of which I think over half of it should be dedicated for storage. So I'm talking $4 or $5 billion.
Are your friends in the Democratic Party agreeing with you? Because when I go to Sacramento, their numbers are much lower. I mean, 1.5 billion is what they're saying.
A lot of this is negotiations,
sure,
and I think the governor will weigh in, and I think when the governor weighs in, that will make a big difference. I think they're also looking to see what we can agree to here in Washington on a package that deals with some version of the Feinstein-Costa legislation or the Valledeo legislation, and what kind of component we have for storage.
When we come back, I want to continue this conversation. Okay, for our viewers on HLN, we thank you for joining us. For our other viewers, we'll be right back. Sir, I'd like to speak with you about immigration as well, a very important issue in your district. A lot of folks work in agriculture. Some may be documented, some may not be documented. What are they saying to you about their desires behind immigration reform?
Well, I think there's a strong consensus, bipartisan consensus in the San Joaquin Valley and in much of California to fix a broken immigration system. If we have a broken water system in California, we have a broken immigration system in America. And it's time we fix it. You know, I was for the Kennedy-McCain measure when Senator Kennedy was still alive. And I've supported a version of ag jobs. And the Senate bill that passed last year on a bipartisan basis, strong bipartisan vote, historic, I think if it were on the House floor tomorrow, would pass because I think there are sufficient Democratic and Republican votes to pass that.
And some of your colleagues in the Republican caucus in California would agree with you.
Yes.
But the challenge is, how does that bill get to the floor for those that are looking to see it to come to the floor?
Well, the real problem is the internal debate, the intramural debate among the Republican conference. Some, sadly, refer to the Senate bill as amnesty. It's not amnesty. If you, in fact, have to prove that you have a job and that you basically indicate that you came here illegally, you pay a fine for coming here illegally, and then for 5 years you have to show that you've maintained employment, that any back fines or fees or penalties you have paid or taxes, and then after 5 years you have the ability to then apply for a green card. And then after 7 years, after being a good
permanent resident,
then on the 13th year you have the ability to apply for citizenship. That is a earned path. It is not amnesty, period.
So Speaker Boehner, a couple weeks back, maybe a month back, was looking at that very element. He had some concerns about actual citizenship granting after a certain period of time, and he seemed to be focused more on permanent residence, a green card. The president, who had been very clear he wanted to see a path to citizenship, seemed to be willing to negotiate on that point. But yet, even with that pronouncement, it seems as if Speaker Boehner has pulled back a bit on
Well,
it.
and I think that's, again, because of the internal politics within the Republican conference. I mean, let's be honest. The Republicans have tied themselves in knots on this thing. I mean, you know, we heard Mitch McConnell argue that, you know, we just don't trust this president on the basis of the first point, which is security, increased security, even though we've deported more people than any other administration in history, which he's been criticized for, and we've more than tripled the Border Patrol agents over the last 5 years.
Senator
Schumer said, right, if it's security that, and you don't trust this president, we can deal with that easily. We'll make it effective 2017. And they went, So what the fact of the matter is internally, some of these folks simply do not want to deal with this issue, you know, see everything as amnesty when it's not. And I think, frankly, there's an anti-immigrant sentiment among some within the conference on this issue. Otherwise, how else can you explain it?
But what's also interesting, if you look at that, and I've thought about that very issue, is for some of these members of the Republican conference, they live in districts with virtually no immigrants.
Correct.
And so it could be that they simply, the issue is not of importance.
Well, and it is in California, and it is in my district.
We understand.
You know, 58% of my district is Hispanic, and there's very, very strong feelings on this issue, not just among that community, but also among the farmers. I mean, 70% of our workforce in the Valley are folks that are believed to be here illegally. And so I think there is a common cause for all the right reasons, both in terms of the merits, and it, of course, works itself on the politics. But 80 congressional districts after the 2010 reapportionment have less minorities, and you know, then I think feel less compelled to deal with this issue. And I think that's where a lot of the anti-immigrant feelings come from.
You mentioned the farmers, presumably business owners,
Right.
And they have been very strong and clear that they would like to see immigration reform.
Oh, yeah.
A constituency, presumably, of the Republican Party.
Yes.
Will that push the party toward reform?
They've worked very hard to convince Republican leadership, not only in California, but back here in Washington, that they would like this problem fixed. They negotiated the agreements on the language of the Senate bill. This coalition, I mean, when you think about it, is as broad a bipartisan coalition as I can think of. You have the United States Chamber of Commerce, you have the Farm Bureau organizations and all the other ag organizations. You have businesses throughout the country that are supportive of this. You have a faith-based organization of religious groups that run the spectrum of the United States. And yet, it seemingly is very difficult to get that
I want to
across.
thank you for joining us. My name is Brad Pomerance, coming to you from
Brad.
Washington, D.C.
Good to be with you again.
We are here in Washington, D.C. My name is Brad Pomerance. Inside the United States Congress, we are joined by Jerry McNerney. He is a member of the U.S. Congress representing significant portions of the Delta region, Stockton, Antioch, Lodi. I want to talk to you about those areas. We know the city of Stockton filed for bankruptcy. That whole area has had a real tricky time during the economic downturn, but I understand the news is better.
It is. We still have some challenges. And a few years ago, you could see that it was a very tough situation. Our unemployment was 20% or higher. We were the foreclosure capital of the country at different quarters. But things have turned. For one thing, the crime rate has dropped significantly in the last year. We saw an almost 60% drop in homicides over a 1-year period. We've seen home prices shoot up about 30–40% in the last year. We see the Port of Stockton, which is a tremendous economic engine, creating jobs, new businesses moving in, and so I see a real turnaround, and I see it on the streets. You just feel better, and
good to hear.
You know, a lot of it has to do with public safety, and a lot of it has to do with just making sure people are getting the resources they need, businesses. I've got a couple bills out there to expand the definition of an empowerment zone so that businesses in our community can qualify for loans, and also a bill I think that's very important that will allow business to hire folks that have been unemployed. So working together at all levels of government with the private sector, I think we can really turn this thing around.
While the economy in your region is turning around, there's another pressure coming down. And what is that pressure? That's the pressure of the drought. And you are in the Delta region, which is such a sensitive region of the state, both literally and metaphorically. And so I want to get a sense from you, how are you, your constituents, doing as California faces this historic drought?
Well, as you've mentioned, the drought is a concern to everybody in the state, and it's probably the worst drought in history. So we have a lot to worry about. There is water, but it needs to be used very judiciously. We want to make sure that we put our resources in the future into planning so that we can store more water, so that we can, excuse me, so that we can recycle water, so that we can reuse it, so that we use water efficiently. I've got some programs out there, some bills to do just that, to encourage business to hire water efficient products. And I'm working with the governor, of course, and the president to make sure that all levels, again, of government are on this one. It's an opportunity in a way for us to work together to solve the problem and for long-term planning for our state.
I want to talk to you about storage because that has become the buzzword, that California needs more storage. Your friends on the Republican side of the aisle in Washington are very firm on the need for additional storage. In Sacramento as well, there's a big cry for storage. But there doesn't seem to be consensus on what type of storage, when that storage will be built, how it will be built. How do we move the signpost further on this?
Well, I think that's an excellent question. I think there is a consensus in the state, and everybody agrees that we need more storage. So how do we get there from here? Certainly below ground storage, aquifer storage, is something that nobody would have a problem with. In fact, some of our county commissioners enlightened me recently about a potential for about 1.1 million acre feet of underground storage in our county. So there are resources available, and we need to exploit those underground storage resources throughout the state, throughout the valley in particular. And then the above ground storage problem is a little trickier because of environmental concerns. Right. What we want to do is look at what reservoirs we have that can be raised.
Let's talk more about that when we come back. For our viewers on HLN, I want to thank you so much for joining us. For our other viewers, we'll be right back with Congressman Jerry McNerney. Sir, you were discussing groundwater, and obviously groundwater, like you said, there could be a plethora of groundwater. We have plenty of ground. But the challenge is we're seeing people digging deeper to access groundwater and accessing it at very low levels, which is causing some real damage to the ground. There's a term called subsidence, yes, where the sponge, as I understand it, is being crunched so much that you could never recharge again.
Well, what we want to do is, when we have good rain years, is to store that water in the ground so that it doesn't deplete the aquifers to the degree that we would start having those sort of compression problems. And that's possible. We see on a good rain year, we have a lot of flow. If we can manage to store it when we have those wet years, I think we'll be in pretty good shape.
So we've discussed storage, but let's continue. Where do we go from here on storage? Back in Sacramento, there are discussions about bond measures, but it does still seem to be that we're not at consensus.
Well, the consensus is not that we don't need to do storage. The consensus is how to go about it, what to include. There's reservoirs all the way from Shasta all the way up in the north to San Luis, and in my district, Los Vaqueros. Some of these can be raised without too much environmental damage, and others we need to be very concerned. So that's the challenge.
But storage is a long-term solution.
Yes.
What do we do today, though? The drought is today. What do we do?
Well, we want to make sure that we allocate the water that we have in a way that benefits the state the most, that doesn't hurt the farmers. And if farmers are being asked to put land out of use, then they need to be compensated to a certain degree. So we want to make sure that our recycling capabilities are intact, that we can take water that's there, that's not totally salt contaminated, to be desalinated and so on. So there's solutions today, but really we're in a tough situation. We need to be very careful.
You mentioned desal, and that is a potential solution. You may know in Carlsbad, a private company is building a desalination facility, which is exciting but expensive. So where do we go with the future of desal?
Well, there's some exciting technology that's coming about.
You're an engineer.
And it's going to lower the cost of desal. And also, depending on where you put your desal facilities, if they put them where the water's not totally salt water like the sea, then some of our groundwater is contaminated but can be desaled very cheaply. And in parts of the delta that it's not that is brackish, that can be desaled very cheaply. So there's opportunities.
Let's talk about the Delta.
Okay.
We know that the governor has proposed what's known as the Bay Delta Conservation Plan.
Okay.
Some call it Peripheral Canal Part 2. I'm not saying I'm calling it that, but that's what some are calling it. A lot of support behind it, a lot of dissent behind it, and I'm looking at a dissenter.
Well, my concern is that the plan as it's being proposed leaves out the interests of the folks that live in the Delta. And I represent the Delta, so I'm concerned. But a bigger concern is that if we don't get all the stakeholders involved in a solution, then we're not going to move forward. It'll be hung up in the courts or whatever, and we don't want that. What I want is all of our stakeholders, our farmers, our metropolitan areas, and our local regions to work together, and I think there's solutions out there that make sense, that we can agree on.
Are we early enough in the process where the Bay Delta Conservation Plan can be written in such a way that those stakeholders will be considered? You know, the governor has made this one of his key projects. It's not part of the bond that we've discussed. Where are we in the process?
Well, we're pretty far along.
We
are.
are.
And it's unfortunate because if we would have taken the time to get all of us involved, I think we could come to a solution. And right now we're heading down a path toward conflict on this issue, which is, in my opinion, it's not going to benefit anyone.
So where do we go from here? I mean, this is, aside from the drought, the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, or whatever plan you want to call it, something needs to happen on the Delta.
Well, we need to have a plan put forward and an agreement, again, with people from all over the state as to what will work. And I think there's an effort to do that now. Our office is involved in an effort. We want to make sure we move forward with that as the Bay Delta Conservation Plan starts to stall out, which it will.
Really?
We'll be ready to move forward with a more broad-based agreement.
As we conclude, how are your constituents? Tough times right now with the drought?
They are. The drought's not affecting us directly too much. Some of our farmers in the southern part of my district, it is, but we're worried about the economy. We're worried about creating jobs.
Okay.
And that's my focus.
His name is Jerry McNerney, member of the U.S. Congress. My name is Brad Pomerance, and we are joining you from the nation's capital, Washington, D.C.